let's talk about bass. Riffical Records presents The Making of Project Gemineye 4, From Creation to Completion, with Mark Anthony Kay. Greetings, friends, and welcome to the next episode of PG4, The Making of an Album. And as you can probably guess, today we're going to be taking a look at bass. Now, bass guitar is not my first instrument, I'll be honest, but it's an instrument that I've grown to love quite a lot since I got, full-time into making records on my own. I used to not have such an appreciation of the instrument, mainly because back in the day, I just wasn't so, knowledgeable about the instrument itself. I mean, a lot of music that I love nowadays all have bass players that are standout, whether it's Gentle Giant or Rush, King Crimson, Iron Maiden. They all have fantastic bass players, and all of them bring something different and special to the instrument. For myself, I like to think that my style of bass playing is a combination of a lot of those different bass players kind of melded into one. I'd never dare to assume that I'm as good as those players that I mentioned, but they're definitely strong influences in my playing. My bass is an Ibanez Sound Gear. I believe it's a 400 or it's a sound gear. I think it's a 400. I'm not too sure. I'll put a note up if it's something different. But I've always loved this guitar. It has, as you can see, quite a few knobs. One of them is the volume. This is the splitter between the pickups. So if you turn it one way, it'll go to this pickup. If you turn it the other way, it'll go to here, and then you can just kind of blend it. This is the top end, the treble. This is the middle. Sorry, this is the top. This is the middle, and this is the bass. And this is a kind of split. If you want to take the pickup and make it into kind of like a single coil, I think, or it could possibly be a phase switch. Honestly, I've never touched it, so I'm not 100% certain because I've always loved the sound that I get out of it as is, which is. Now, this is an active bass, which means that you have to plug in a battery to it, and that's part of what gives it its sound. Now, on the record, PG4, in the years 3073, I used two distinctly different bass sounds when I recorded this record. One of them is this one that you hear now, which is the same sound that I used at the beginning of this episode on my playthrough that I did at the very top, which is this. Now, that's a very sort of, very growly, bit of distortion on it. It almost seems more like it leans towards Lemmy, not as extreme. He used a lot of distortion on his bass sound. And he was also a very big user of chords. So Lemmy was because they only had one guitar player, essentially. There was one era in Motorhead where they used two guitar players. But when it was just the three-piece, he relied on a heavy, distorted sounding bass and playing a lot of chords. Like, to kind of, make up for the lack of the other guitar player. Now, of course, I can add more distortion to it, which would sound like this. Sorry, I hope I didn't blow anybody's speakers out doing that. But yeah, that's more kind of distortion. Now, basically what I'm doing here is this is my pod that I'm using, and I've loved using it for bass because, again, you have a variety of different amplifiers you can use. What I used for the bass, because they do have a separate bass pod, I've never bothered to get it. I just kind of used this because a lot of the guitar players I loved through the years ended up using guitar amps for sound, believe it or not. For a time period, Steve Harris used a Marshall head and Marshall cabinets actually for some of his bass sound. Chris Squire is it's well documented. He had a Marshall heads. He even has this very sacred Marshall head that he has. If you look at some of the gear run-throughs before he passed away, there was the Marshall is there, very present in his sound, and they even show it. And he also was a person who liked using distortion in his sound, or overdrive, sort of, to make his sound a bit bigger. Same with Geddy Lee, he did the same thing. A lot of bass players did that, so that kind of sound is very evident in their sound. That sort of tone is evident in their sound, and I love doing that as well, mainly because when you're in a mix with a lot of guitars and keyboards, if you have a sound that's more, I'm going to say more of a traditional sound that a lot of newer bands in the 2000s liked, was where they would scoop out the mids, pardon me. So here's the sound that I have normally. Now if you take the mids out of that, like that, now sure, it sounds kind of cool. You did that, now you kind of pop in a bit more bass, right? Add more top end into it. And you have that kind of, very 2000 kind of ish sound, bass sound, I think that's actually which is kind of very Alice in Chainsy. But the problem with that is, unless you actually have a guitar player who's willing to adjust his sound to complement that bass sound will get lost, especially in a double guitar situation. So what I like to do, and what a lot of bass players like the Chris Squires and the Harrises do, is they pop up the mid. So here's thy sound again. Now, if you take the mid frequency and jack it, and you'll hear a difference when I turn it up. Now, of course, that does sound kind of disgusting on its own, and not a sound that most people would probably want to have. But in the context of a band situation, it definitely stands out more. And when you do lines, like if you go like, you're going to hear that a lot better with that sound than you would with the scooped sound. You'll probably never hear any of that kind of playing in there. Traditionally, people who have more of the low end with the bass out of it tend to do more like the sticking with the root stuff like that. Where it's just more riding the bass, right? Which is, there's nothing wrong with that, just what the music calls for. If that's what it calls for, then that's what you do. So that's one of the sounds, which is the sort of Marshall 1987 model, which is, it's not 19, they don't call it the 1987 because of the year. That's just the model number. I think that bass head, or that guitar head, sorry, is actually a 70s Marshall head, and it was very popular with guitar players and with bass players too. So that's one of the sounds that I use. Now I'm gonna cut, and I'm gonna go over to the other sound that I use. I'll first do a short run through with that sound first, and I'll come back and talk about it a bit more. So I'll be right back. Okay, we're back. So what you heard there before I just came back now is me playing the bass through the Ampeg SCRDI. I will put the picture of it here. I have it sitting right in front of me here. See if I can just quickly kind of lift it up so you can see it. Yeah, it's gonna be, there we go. There it is. Sorry, it's a bit heavy. Okay, so, and what this is basically is a DI unit, but has the brains of an Ampeg amplifier in it. It has a volume control bass, mid, treble, and it has a couple of things that are very synonymous with the Ampeg sound, which is the ultra low button and the ultra high, which definitely are very audible when you play the bass on this. So if you have it here with everything pushed in, now if you take the ultra low out, it kind of goes into a more rounder sound. You plug the ultra low back in. Same thing with the ultra high. Take it out, put it back in. It's obviously a noticeable difference. And those sort of differences are what make the Ampeg sound very, very signature. This is why people like the Ampeg sound. If you listen to it too, it's very tight, very punchy, very in your face, much more punchier than the other sound that I use, which is the sort of Marshall sound, which is a lot more mid-rangey, much more harsh and, you know, scratchy and very in your face. This sound is really good if you want to make sure that you have some really solid bottom end in your sound. One of those kind of sounds where if they would lock in with the kick drum nice and solidly, you know, it makes the woofers in your system really push, and it makes the speakers in your car stereo really start pushing air. So that's what I've always loved about the Ampeg, is that it has that really tight sound to it. Now, a lot of bass players have used Ampeg through the years. Billy Sheehan, Nikki Sixx of Motley Crue. I mean, I could go through dozens of people. Gene Simmons, for a long time, was an Ampeg user. And some of his most known bass sounds were due to the Ampeg sound. I mean, you know, he doesn't have so many like lines that I could show you that would you go, oh, right away I know what that is. Like for example, on Love Gun you have a Plaster Caster, which is just an open A. But that sound is so Ampeg, you can tell it's that. I mean, even like some of his other bass lines. Very, very Ampeg sounding, and you know, you can go through all kinds of songs like that. But for my recordings, I ended up using the sound for songs like "Keepers of the Past," where the song actually starts off with bass guitar, right? So if you want to have that kind of I wanted to have that kind of a punchy sound where it just like kind of stands out more. It jumps out more, right? That sort of noting, right? I really love that sort of punch in the strings. It's great. I mean, I've really enjoyed it. This is probably one of the best investments I've made as far as recording bass guitar goes, because this just adds so much more fullness, and because it has an XLR out, which is like the speaker cable connection to it, the sound is much more quieter. But it's also a stronger signal to commit to recording. Sometimes with 1/4-inch signals, when you use here, like how we use it for the Line 6 pod, it can get a little noisy and not as full a sound. But like I said, it depends on what you want, right? You may want that kind of a sound in one of the songs, so you use it. So I like having the flexibility of having both of these sounds available to me. And I mean, we can go like way into, down the rabbit hole when as soon as you start putting it in through here. I mean, it's running into my mixing board. You can do way more with it even in there, right? So you have a sound. I can adjust it on the board now. So that's very Guns N' Roses, right? Sorry, I hope I didn't blow speakers out again with that. But again, that was very much scooping out the mids out of there, pumping up the bass, and again, that Ampeg sound just goes cutting through there. So yeah, again, those kind of sounds, the combination of it, and importantly, this bass, I think, is very important as well. Again, those pickups, they're active pickups, so, and having the onboard sort of preamp equalizer on here with the mid, treble, and bass definitely help in shaping the sound into any kind of sound you can imagine. Again, like I mentioned before, you have to look at making the overall sound the important thing. If your mid on your guitars are really jacked up at, let's say, 1.5K or to 2000 or 2K, you don't want to have those frequencies bumped up on here. You want to bump up something else, maybe 800 hertz or 700 to make that stick out, because it's like a puzzle. You don't want to have the same thing overlapping, otherwise they'll start battling with each other and eliminating one another. So having these things help in doing that, finding your tone and putting it in there. So that's what I did with the bass for this album. I think it turned out really good. I think you guys will enjoy it. And that's it for bass. Next time we're going to take a quick look at keyboards and then vocals, and then we'll be on to mixing. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this little segment. Bye for now.